Hello and welcome to the Enterprise Excellence webinar series. And today we are joined by Robert Miller. Today Robert will be focusing on the subject of how leaders can learn to hear the voice of the Shingo principles. And just before we hand over to Robert, just a bit about the Enterprise Excellence Network for those who aren't familiar with us. This is a network that is founded by Professor Peter Hines, and the workshops are led by Peter. And we have partnerships with benchmarking host sites. At the moment, we're doing this all virtually, but hopefully we'll get back to normal not so far away. But if you would like to find out more about us, you will receive an email after this webinar where you can contact myself and look at our website as well, the enterpriseexcellencenetwork.com. Okay, so today there'll be an approximately 30-minute presentation by Robert, followed by a dedicated question and answer session, which Peter will help Bob with in facilitating. So feel free to ask any questions you have for Robert in the question tab box at the end of the webinar. Okay, I'll just hand over to Peter just to say a few more words about Robert. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Emma, and good morning, good afternoon, whatever time of day it is with you. And welcome to our session. So I'm very pleased to welcome Bob Miller. This is his recent book, which he's going to sort of base some of the session around. And Bob has many years of experience in the lean world, and is a former director of the Shingo Institute, where he obviously gained a very deep insight into the Shingo principles, which he's going to share some learnings, and I think get you to do a little bit of work as well. So, so Bob, with that, very pleased to welcome you to the session.
Thank you very much. It's my privilege to be here with you today, and welcome. I'm eager to talk about this this subject. So, I was the executive director of the Shingo Institute during the years when we developed the Shingo model. So, actually, I have to say that it took a lot of years to learn how to describe the essence of what the Shingo model was about and why it's had such an impact in the world. And as I drew to a conclusion of my work at the university, I felt like it was important to capture some of the ideas, because we spent many hours and days and months trying to deep dive into each principle and tried to understand why it was that principle had such an impact, and how a leader needed to live or behave, or how the people in an organization would act if they really held to the principles and they had deeply embedded the principle into their character, their way of being. And so I wrote the book because I didn't want to lose that knowledge, and I didn't want it to be lost forever, because things have a way of dissipating over time, and so it felt like it was important to me to capture. So that's what the book is about. And today I'd like to review some of the most important ideas that are contained in the book, and that I talk about often whenever I talk with leaders. So let me just dive in. I'm going to speak rather quickly, because I want to get through the content as fast as I can and allow 20 minutes or so for your questions, so that we can kind of apply them the way you'd like to apply them. So the first question is, how does a principle speak? Does a principle really speak? If you're going to hear it, it has to say something. But when you really think about it, we often talk about how customers have a voice, suppliers have a voice, employees have a voice. In America, the Native American Indians say the wind has a voice, the rain has a voice, the sun has a voice. And those who are in tune with the voice of the sun or the wind or the rain are able to live a better life. Well, this is really true with principles as well. They do have a voice, and they speak to us all day long. But we don't hear the voice of a principle with our ears, because it's an idea, it's an inanimate thing. But we hear principles with our hearts. And when I talk about principles, I just did it. When I talk about a principle, I find myself putting my hands to my heart, because that's where we hear a principle. It's more like feeling a principle. We know that principles speak truth, and truth resonates somewhere outside of our head and into our beings. And so when I hear someone speak of a principle, it just feels right to me. It feels true. It feels like it's correct. And Stephen Covey would call that self-evident. The correctness of a principle is self-evident to us when we hear them and we feel them inside. And principles parallel very closely with natural laws. In the book, I spend more time trying to differentiate a little bit more precisely what that is. But for now, let's equate a principle with a natural law. And a natural law are the things that govern the outcomes that we experience in our life. Whenever we see something happening around us, whatever it is, we know that it's the outcome of some natural law that's being applied to that thing. Well, the principles that we discuss here and that are part of the Shingo model are natural laws that govern the creation of excellence inside of enterprises. So the question then becomes, how do principles relate to leaders? So principles, remember I said principles govern outcomes, or the word that leaders use in business is results. Principles govern the results that leaders are responsible for. So doesn't it only make sense then that a leader would devote an enormous amount of their time or energy to understanding the principles or the natural laws that govern the results that they're accountable for? I say we call it the 80-80 rule. So 80% of a leader's focus, and I'm going to actually end at this same spot, 80% of a leader's focus really should be in one way or another associated with the principles that govern the outcomes they're responsible for. So principles, because they're naturalized, they don't change over time. They're stable. Think about that. In your business, what part of your business is stable that you can count on over time? Not very much of it. Almost everything inside of our organizations are changing and changing constantly. And because that's true, principles become an anchor that you can hold on to and depend on it being and meaning and impacting your business the same tomorrow, a month from now, a year from now, at the end of your planning horizon, at the end of your lifetime. The principles will affect your outcomes exactly the same way. So the other thing that's wonderful about principles for business is that principles are universal, meaning everyone will understand them. Most of our businesses now hire people from all different walks of life, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different geographic backgrounds. And so it doesn't make any difference. In my experience in teaching principles now in almost every corner of the world, when you talk about a principle, people hear them the same. They understand them the same and they feel the same to them. So if you want to create alignment of people in your organization, principles that govern your outcomes are a powerful source of creating unity and commonality inside of a diverse organization. So the other key thing is that living a principled life, meaning living a life that's guided by and followed by and aligned with principles, is a sure way of having followers. I've never known of a leader that was what we would call a principled leader that wasn't admired and had a wonderful following of people both inside their organization and outside their organization. So living a principled life is a sure way of having followers. So oftentimes we talk about being driven to excellence. So we want to create a passion inside of organizations where people are driven to create enterprise excellence. But then the question comes, where does that drive come from? How do you create a driven to excellence mindset inside of people? But so when you think about it, drive, real drive that's sustainable comes from inside of us. Look at me holding my heart again. Drive comes from inside of us, the same place that principles exist. So when our drive inside each one of us always comes from what we've learned to value in life. So if I learn to value good things, I usually have good outcomes in my life. If I learn to value pride or greed or envy or power, usually those things lead to bad or undesirable outcomes eventually, maybe not in the short term, but certainly in the long term. So what we value become our values. Let me say that again. What we value become our values, and they drive our actions. Our values drive our actions. And of course, the outcomes that we experience in life, in work, in our professions, in our families, in anything, are the outcomes of our actions. So what we learn to value is really, really important. That makes the $64,000 question, what must we value in order to achieve excellence? What are the values that we want everyone that we work with to possess? What do we want them to value so that they will be driven from the inside of them to achieve the kind of results that will be excellent for the organization? So I'm going to give four things. So this is kind of a summary and also kind of a way to point us forward. So think about the logic, the reason here. Excellence is the outcome of valuing the right things, right? That's the sum of what we just said. Excellence is an outcome of valuing the right things. Second, principles are the natural laws that govern the outcomes. Okay? So, following that logic, driven to excellence, or the passion to create excellence, comes when we value the principles that govern the creation of excellence. So now, it behooves us as leaders or as members and individuals who are trying to influence inside of companies to value the principles that create sustainably excellent outcomes. And when we lead by those principles, we get excellence. And this is what I call a sustainable culture of enterprise excellence. When all of the people inside of an organization have learned to value deeply, learn to value the principles that govern the creation of excellence. So I know of no other way that a leader can create sustainable excellence. It's the only way, and it's true in any part of any organization in any part of the world. So then what is the leader's role? That becomes a really important question. What does the leader role? If it's 80% of the time, most people they blanch white when I say that, because they're already spending 120% of their available time doing the busy work of trying to create results, executing on their strategies, their business plans. And now to say 80% of your time has to be something else. Well, it really isn't something else. It's the way in which you do the 80% of the stuff that you do. So learning to change the way you lead or the way you manage, the way you communicate, the way you think is the hard work of becoming a principled leader in an organization that's focused on key principles. So leaders balance the scorecard. Well, yeah, they balance the scorecard today, but if you look at almost every organization, the balance includes all of the things that are required, that are thought or understood to be required to create results, but they're all on the results side. Very few leaders have a scorecard that includes the behavioral or the demonstrations of people's commitment to the values of principles. So when I say balancing the scorecard, I mean that to be balancing between principles, that balancing between behaviors that are principle based and results that are outcomes based, metrics based on numbers. So the leaders balance the scorecard between behaviors and results, principles and things. Leaders teach people how to align everything they do with principles of enterprise excellence. So leaders teach people, how do they do that? How does a leader teach people to value principles? That's really important and hard questions to answer. Leaders live by the principles, and they show others how to get results by being obedient to or following or aligning their values with these principles. So they demonstrate it, they live by these principles, learn to live by the principles, and show others how to do it. So remember the Shingo model? I think most of you by now probably have had some exposure to it. The top of, we have guiding principles, and if you follow the arrows on the top, on the outside of the diagram, guiding principles, you align systems to guiding principles that help you to select the appropriate tools for continuous improvement, which help you to achieve results, and then the results affirm the correctness of the guiding principle. And then on the inside, if you work back the other way, guiding principles help to drive results. Remember, principles drive results. And when you study the results, they help you to refine your choice and your application of tools, which help to enable the management systems of the company, which drive the principles deeper into the organization. So that's how the model works. At the very pinnacle of it, we have the guiding principles. And in the Shingo model, when you go to the Shingo Institute and look at them, and Peter's probably talked a lot about these, I know he has, there are 10. I picked 6 out of those 10, which I think are really the core leadership responsibilities. These principles are ones that leaders have the greatest impact on, and absent a leader's influence and demonstration of these things, it's almost impossible. I would say it is impossible to create a sustainable culture of enterprise excellence. So leaders respect every individual. Leaders lead with humility. Leaders seek perfection. Leaders flow value to customers. Leaders assure quality at the source, at every source for every aspect of quality. Leaders create constancy of purpose. And we could spend days studying each one of those principles, and I encourage you to do that. But my experience with most leaders and most organizations has been a very hard reality when it comes to these principles. So let me just review what I tend to see most often in organizations. Leaders want to delegate the work that creates excellence in enterprise or enterprise excellence. It's just so easy with so many other things to do to ask somebody else to take charge of this. And it just, that doesn't work. Those principles are core central principles to the Shingo model and to creating sustainable excellence in organizations. And only leaders can do that. Leaders intuitively understand the principles, they get it here, and they get it here. But there's so many things that distract them, that it's really hard to live and lead by those principles. Leaders often have developed a certain pride, hubris that comes with being promoted so many times, having lots of responsibility, and unfortunately, often one of the outcomes of those promotions is a little bit of arrogance. It makes it hard. Excuse me. It makes it hard to see the truth about our own behaviors and how our behaviors impact the behaviors of others and how those behaviors impact the results they're accountable for. So learning to see the truth about yourself and your own behaviors is a really hard thing for leaders to come to, but very powerful, and it's difficult not to get attracted by the next shiny thing that comes along. Here's a litmus test that you'll be able to apply in any organization. If you look around and your organization seems to be a little bit fat, a little bit bureaucratic, a little bit policy heavy, slow, stodgy, hard to make decisions, hard to bring on new ideas or adopt new things, it's usually because leaders have replaced a conviction valuing principles with bureaucracy. So the way I learned to say that is, in the absence of principles, people create bureaucracy. And who builds the bureaucracy? Usually it's the leaders in the organization. So the more principle-centered an organization becomes, where people learn to value deeply and understand the principles that create the outcomes they're responsible for, they naturally start to peel away the layers of bureaucracy and the things that slow us down, the things that add cost, the things that detract from quality, the things that require more and more people to have to do, or more and more automation to have to do, things that make your organization less excellent in terms of its ability to deliver consistently good results. So what to do? What to do? Stop thinking about continuous improvement as a project or a program. Just stop it. I know you've thought about that and heard that before, but you can't do that. Continuous improvement is not a project or a program. Continuous improvement is a mindset and a deep belief. It's a personal commitment to something. So the leader's role is to change the mindset, to change the belief, and to change the personal commitment of every employee or every associate or every contributor to the organization that they're responsible for. So when you talk about being a hard job, changing a culture or building a culture, it's the hardest, because you're not working with things, you're working with people and their beliefs, and that's hard work. So second, teach principles in everything you talk about continuously. Look for a way to say what you need to say in the context of the principle that governs the outcome that you're describing. Ask others, when other people are talking about something, pause them and say, so what principle is that you're talking about? What principle governs the outcome that you want to get? And how does that affect you? And how will that affect the results that we expect to get? So a strategic plan must include not just the things that we have to do, but what we have to be and how we be that way in order to get that result. That's what a balanced strategic plan would do. So help people to connect everything that they do with the appropriate principles and expect the same thing of others. You, as a leader, take the time to think about what principle of those 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10, or maybe some other principle. These 10 are a great place to start. These 6 are a great place to start for leaders. But think about how those principles affect your work as a leader. and make sure you share that with others. And find number 5, find someone that you can trust. You really need, almost everybody needs a confidant, someone that's close to them that will tell them the truth about their own behaviors. It's so hard to see in yourself your own behaviors, and will tell you the truth about how your behaviors are impacting other people around you. When you see people acting a certain way down in the organization that's counterproductive to the results that you want, stop looking at that person, or don't look at that person first. Say, what is it about what I'm doing that's causing the people to behave this way? And that's a much more powerful place to start your transformation of a culture. And finally, the last one, acknowledge publicly your struggles. So when you know you should be doing something, showing respect in a different way, but you tend to keep doing this, and you now know that when you do this, other people see it this way and it impacts them that way, say it. There's no more powerful way to demonstrate your humility and your desire and your expectation of other leaders and others in the organization that they change and improve than when you say, I did it again. I'm really trying to overcome that. I know I should be doing this, and this is what I'm trying to do. Forgive me when I do this. And it doesn't show weakness, it shows strength. It shows character. And people are always drawn to character and strength in leaders. But if I'm not a leader, suppose I'm just, and some of you on this call today may not be members of the senior management team, but you're influencers, or you're down in the organization working. Let me offer 8 suggestions that might be helpful to you. Always be respectful of the senior leaders in the company. Only speak positively about them. Acknowledge the fact in your mind first, and then in all of your language, that people are a product of their past experiences. And most of our past experiences were not deliberately, purposely focused on these principles. Therefore, it's common and natural for leaders to be behaving in a way incongruent with these principles. So respect people when they get to positions of leadership and they don't possess or demonstrate or are having a hard time changing. Focus first, number 2, on your own circle of influence. What are the things that you can do? Examine your own behaviors and your own values, meaning the things that you've learned to value that are driving your own behaviors. And then make sure that you are living an example of those principles in your own life. Then I promise you, if you do that, your circle, as Covey would describe, your circle of influence will grow and grow and grow to encompass your circle of concern, which may include the senior management of your company. Make sure you align all the management systems that you have influence over with these principles, so they're driving the kind of behaviors that you want to have that will give you the results you're looking for. Look for ways to show others the power of these principles. Be purposeful, but not overbearing or arrogant. So remember that second principle is lead with humility. So as you try and influence others, your humility will be the thing that will attract others to you, and you will become much more influential in the organization. In all of your work, state the goal. So these are, if you're working on a project or you have some outcome you're responsible for, state the goal, how you plan to get there, and the principles that will govern the creation of that success. And in your plan for how you will influence the creation of behaviors in all the people that touch the things you're responsible for that are consistent or congruent with those principles, always, in everything that you do. And when you get an opportunity, and I promise you that if you are living your life and leading in that way in your own circle of influence, you will be given opportunities to coach upward. And when you do, your circle will grow and you'll have a great impact in the organization. So let me just conclude the things that I wanted to say by saying principles have a voice. They absolutely do have a voice. And they speak the truth all day long, every single day. Principles never go on vacations. They never become irrelevant. Just because we don't pay attention to them doesn't mean they aren't impacting your result. They absolutely are. Everything that you're accountable for are being governed by principles. They shout, they don't just speak, but a principle shouts to the person that's learned to listen to them, but they're mute to the people who tune them out. Doesn't mean they're not there, doesn't mean they're speaking, but to that individual, they don't see them and they feel like they're mute. And the most successful people in life, in your organizations, will always be those who have learned to listen to the voice of the principles and learn to live their life by them, by what the principles are saying to them and what they're speaking. So that's a condensation, a 35-minute summary of the things that I learned in my 15 years now, almost 20 years of working with principles and the principles associated with the Shingo model. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Peter, and see if there's some questions that you might have. And I'm going to move back so that I can see. Here we go.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Bob. Always interesting to listen, and over the years I've learned much from you. So thank you for that, and thank you for the presentation.
Thank you, Peter.
So what we're going to do now is open the floor for questions from the audience, and I might take the chance to ask a few of those myself as well.
Okay, you bet.
But we had one that's come in already from John. So John was asking, how do principles differ from values?
Oh, thank you, John. That's one of the most important questions. So if values govern our behaviors, our values drive the things that we do, but principles govern the outcomes of what we do. So principles govern outcomes, values govern behaviors. So if I value things, if I value greed, or if I value power or position or money or financial results, then I will get the outcomes of what principles will say. So if I value my position in the organization more than I value the people in the organization, I disrespect the people. And the principle is respect every individual. So if I value the principle of respect for every individual, I will behave in a certain way. But if I value my position or my power more than the principle, then I will get a different outcome. And it's not because I'm valuing a different principle, it's because I'm disregarding the principle of respect for every individual. So values, that's why you say value principles. What I value in my life should be principles. And so I used to teach a freshman class at Utah State University of incoming freshmen, and they asked me to teach this class to kids who barely got into the university, who were really struggling with their purpose in their school, in their time. And I'd ask them what their values were. and they'd look at me like I was from outer space. They had no idea what their values were. So I'd say, well, what do you value? And they'd look at me like, what do I value? So, yeah, what's important to you? What are the things that are important to you in your life? Oh, they are my friends, my football, my hanging out, my video games, the music that I listen to. So some people would say, well, I value my family. I value being at the university. So then I'd say, okay, I get them to identify the top 5 things that they value. And then I ask them to say, how much time do you spend on the things that you value the most? And then I'd have them create a graph, and then they'd create a histogram. And they learned to see that the things that they valued were not the things that were not going to lead them to have a successful, happy life. They said they valued their mother or their father or their family, but they spent almost no time talking to them. They're away from home. They don't call once every couple of weeks. They check in, when they need their laundry done or something. So values drive behaviors. Whether those behaviors are good or not are determined whether those behaviors are based on principles. Principles govern outcomes. They're natural laws. Covey said, the way Covey said that is, because principles govern behaviors because values govern behaviors and principles govern results, value principles. And that's what I'm trying to say here. Learn to value principles. If you value principles, the outcomes will be positive. Does that help, John? Hopefully that will help.
Hopefully. John, come back if you want to add anything else on that one. So a few more coming in. So one from Paul here. He says, seems math-based with people overtones. Focus on right input variables to achieve right output variables.
Well, I suppose that's true. In the Shingo Institute, the way the roots of the Shingo Institute were the Shingo Prize. And the Shingo Prize required evaluation of an organization and scoring the things that you saw to determine whether they met a certain threshold. So it's a numerical tabulation of things that you observed. And we used to give the Shingo Prize. We were looking at all the tools and all the methodologies associated with enterprise excellence or operational excellence. And so and we scored them on a scale of 0 to 5. Everything that we saw based on what we expected to see. So you develop a standard and say, okay, well, if you did this, that would be a 5. What we saw was this, that's a 3. So you add them all up and you get a score. And we were giving the prize out to organizations by doing that. But what we learned, what we saw, was that very few of the companies that received the Shingo Prize were able to sustain their excellence over the long term by tabulating only the results, things that we were looking at. We learned that it was the culture that was creating the results that we had to observe. So we had to figure out a way to put a score on behaviors. So that led us to discover principles, because principles define ideal behaviors. The more you understand a principle, the more deeply you understand it, the more you understand what ideal really looks like. And so what we did is we spent several years trying to hone our expectation of what an ideal principle-based behavior was. And that became the 5 score. So when you go in to evaluate an organization, you're looking at both sides of the equation. You're looking at the results side and scoring it, and you're looking at the behavioral side and saying, What is the degree to which we see this ideal behavior? And you can take now, if you take 10 people who really understand the principle well and are thinking about ideal behaviors the same way, they can observe the behavior of what they see and score it almost exactly the same. So it is, you're putting a numerical value on behaviors and people, as well as the behaviors that you put on, or as the results that you're putting on the results. Great question.
Okay, thank you, Bob. So this one, I'm not sure I understand, but hopefully you will. So I'll read it out for you. So if absence of principles leads to bureaucracy, how does that fit with compliance processes? They're considered as a result of values and principles, but also perceived as bureaucracy and admin overload.
Yeah. Well, there are some things you have to have. You know, if you have regulations that are government regulations, or industry regulations like ISO standards that have to be maintained, then yes, you have to create those certain degree of them. But I've talked to a lot of people who are responsible for ISO and other kinds of standards, and they will tell you that there is a lot of variation and latitude around what is an acceptable policy or procedure, and writing those procedures in a way that acknowledge the capability of people to behave in the right way, to act in the right way, to make the right choices when something happens, when there's some variation that occurs in the process. That can be done, and it can be simplified greatly. It doesn't mean that you go to zero in terms of procedures or policies. It means that you write them in a way that acknowledges the capability of people and the correctness of the principles and the depth of principles. So if you think about it, the procedures or the bureaucracy is the thing that keeps the train on the track. Over time, as people become in the organization becomes more principled, the more of those things that you can peel out. You don't peel them out until you have the capability to replace it with people who know how to act and do act, always from a principled point of view. And over time, you can delayer and peel and simplify those regulations and bureaucracies to the point that it becomes much more simple. It's just like you don't get to single piece flow in one action. It's the outcome of a lot of work over a long period of time. Delayering bureaucracy is the same thing. It happens over a long period of time from doing the right things in the right way. Does that help?
Hopefully it helps. So Walter, come back if you want to ask more about that. I'm just going to ask one for myself just before we go on. So in reading the book, I think one of the most powerful things I found was a very small thing, but I think very important, is the difference between we all use Toyota as a big lean company, and they have continuous improvement and respect for people. But you did chose not to use respect for people. You use the respect every individual. And I think the difference between the two I found really intriguing and important. So maybe you'd like to share that with the wider audience, because I think it's a really important thing.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. That was a really hard and a long lesson for me to learn too. So I found that if you say to almost anybody, do you respect people? They'll almost always say, yeah, of course I do. What do you mean? How dare you suggest otherwise? Of course I respect people. But then you say, well, do you respect this person? Well, wait a minute. That person, is not very dependable. Or do you respect this person over here? Well, no, that person, they don't really have a college education, or they don't have a master's degree. Or do you respect this person over here? Well, I respect people, but I don't respect that person because I know how they treat their family or their spouse or their children. So it's really easy to say, I have a respect for people, but to say, I respect every single person is a very different thing. So then it invokes a lot of conversation about how can I respect somebody whose behavior is not correct or is not in line with the principle. And now you start to say, well, what is it about that person that I don't respect or that I don't like? And then so you start to remember what I said a minute ago about how you lead upwards. You don't judge the leader upwards whose behavior is different than what you want. You respect them irregardless of their behavior. You respect them because they're human beings. You respect them, not just a leader, but everyone. You respect them because they're human beings. They're not rocks. They're not chickens. They're human beings. And the value that they have is intrinsic to a human being. I may not value the things that they are doing. I may not like their behaviors right now, but I can't, if I want to improve that person and I want them to become part of the team, I have to approach them from a position of respect. And that means I genuinely respect them as a human being, and I respect the potential that they have as a human being. I'm not happy where they are right now, and I won't accept it. I can't tolerate it because their behavior is affecting our results. But I value and I respect their potential to become a valued employee and behave the way I want. And I'm willing to invest some of my time and my energy and my capital to give them a chance to develop their potential. Now, my patience might be limited. I'm not going to do that forever if they don't change. But I don't have a prayer of getting them aligned with the principles of the company, of the core corporation, or principles of enterprise excellence, unless I approach them, everyone, from a position of respect. My brother, I have a handicapped brother who taught me that principle as I learned to respect him and all of the gifts that he brings to humanity and to our family and to everyone that gets near him. Everyone who touches Kevin's life is impacted by him, and it's because he's a human being and he has intrinsic value. It's not something somebody gives him, and that's true of every single person, regardless where they are in their station in life at the moment.
Okay, thank you. So a couple of follow-ups here. So Ultro says, yes, that helps a lot. That was the question about compliance, etc.
Good.
And my friend Julie here, she says a very powerful point being made here, very well, about respect for individuals. So that's nice.
Thank you, Julie.
So we got a question here from Chiranjib, who says, in small and medium enterprises, how could the Shingo model be implemented? I found SMEs are struggling for the right leadership, especially in family-driven businesses. How can the leadership be trained, or these values, into this sort of SME environment?
Yeah. Well, if you don't use the word train, that's a good start. Because you don't train values into somebody. You create experiences for people that when they've completed their experience, when they've had an experience and they look back on it and they see, when I behaved this way, or when I followed this principle, I got this result. When I didn't follow that principle, these principles, I got this result. So the leader's role, the influencer's role, is to help manage the creation of experiences that help people to discover for themselves the correctness of the principle, and to facilitate that personal learning journey. So it's actually, it doesn't matter whether it's a big company or a little company. Actually, in a small to medium-sized company, you're probably in a better position to influence more of the key leaders, positional leaders in the company. And oftentimes, privately held companies are led by people who still are close to the people. And when reminded of the principles, will recognize them, they'll hear them, they'll feel them, and embrace them. But remember, the hardest, one of the new, it's not new. One of the things that I've learned is that the hardest thing for an influencer to do is to not teach, not train, but to create experiences for people to learn for themselves. And when you think about you, you're learning for yourself. You're learning from what you're doing, not from what somebody said to you. I promise you that after we hang up on this webinar, if you don't do something, you'll forget it. If you don't create an experience for yourself that will enable your own learning and your own personal transformation, it will have been for naught. And the same thing is true. You can't just sit down, or you can't create a classroom environment that changes someone's beliefs. You have to create experiences that are deeply profound, and then help them to learn, to examine what their experience was, and see how the principles impacted the results that they got. So you have to, that's having somebody around you, someone like Peter, or someone who can help you to create experiences for people that are at their heart principle centered, that enable people to be able, when they're finished with it, they can look back and they can see how and to what degree the principles impacted what they experienced. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you for that. So time's almost up, Bob, but I thought I'd just, well, I've got one more question. So I'll ask my one first, or I'd like a view on this point. So having many years experience, not quite as many as yourself, but many years experience of working with companies challenging for the Shingo Prize, one of the things I found is that you see this sort of principle-based approach being adopted by the company, etc. And for me, the secret of the really good companies is that unlocks the intrinsic motivation of the whole workforce, which, and then if you can do that, and you can also create meaning for them. So meaning for them is not just aligning them to the company business, but meaning for themselves, something personal about their own career, their own meaning, their values, etc. And then respecting them as individuals so that they can go and follow that, create that meaning for themselves. And for me, that almost is what I see in these prize-winning companies. I appreciate your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, one of the in the last chapter, the second last chapter of the book, I dealt with this. I talked about this, and My feeling is that at the end of a career that's filled with nothing but financial results for a company, and people became a means to the end, you might have a nice home, you might have a nice car, you might have a fat retirement check, an inheritance, but you won't have the things that will be most meaningful. And knowing that your leadership created powerful people who have learned how to be successful in way more than just business, but successful in every aspect of their life. Think about this. Those principles that I described, that we talked about earlier, if I could get back to it, you see if I can, right there. So can you still see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. So if you could create a culture in an organization where people learn to have respect for every single individual, think of the impact that's going to have on a person's life, not just in the office, but when they walk home, when they walk in the door of their home, or when they're working in their community. If they lead with humility in the workplace, they become a humble person. It doesn't mean they become a meek person or a passive person necessarily. When I talk about that, you don't hear me describing it in submissive, meek way. I talk about humility in a very powerful way. Think about the impact a person that has that attribute in their life will have. Seek perfection. That's a principle that's influences the way I manage my home, the way I take care of my yard, the way I improve my relationships with people, the way I work and serve in my community. Flowing value, assuring everything that I do is of the highest quality before I give it to somebody else. Those aren't principles about business only. Those are principles about life. And so the most satisfaction, I can say, without doubt, I can promise any leader, no matter how much money you made or how successful your business was, the thing that will bring the most satisfaction to you on the day of your retirement will be in the faces of the people whose lives you changed deeply in a very, very personal way. That will allow you to sleep well and enjoy your money much, much more than just focusing on the results.
Thank you, Bob. So we'll just take this last question from Walter again. Do you have an example of how to create this experiences principle? Are there standard group exercises, for instance, that could be used?
Well, again, it's creating experiences for people. Sometimes the experiences are only deeply personal conversations. So let me say, I'm mostly spending time with my family now, but there is a company that I'm working with, and here's who asked the same question, and here's what we concluded that they're doing. They bought copies of, and this is not a promotion for the book, by the way, but it's going to sound like it, but they bought copies of the book for their managers, and then they formed study groups. And so in a group of 5, they're reading chapter by chapter the discussion, the topics, and they're getting together then for luncheons or after hours or even in work time. They're having discussions on the things that they learned in that section of the book. And then every few months we have a webinar, and they all come onto the webinar, and we talk about what they're learning and what they're experiencing and what they're applying. So what they're talking about in their little small groups is, how do I apply this? You know, where do we see this? What are the behaviors that we see? If this is what we should be seeing, what do we see? So they go look, and then they come back and they talk with each other, and they get close enough that they can share their own behaviors with each other. And then they bring their things that didn't work so well to the webinar, and we'll talk about that. They don't have to, you don't have to do that with me. You could do it with Peter. There's other people. I know that there's other people that are getting enough experience now that they can help you with that. Or if you're good at it yourself, you don't even need that. You can just come back together and say, what worked, what didn't work, what don't we know, or what do we know now, or what did we experience from that. So just create those kinds of small group discussions that are pointing each other towards actions that they can do. Working on systems is a great way to do it. So if you can say, well, we just talked about the principle of assuring quality at the source. So what's a system in our area that contributes to that we can work on, and how do we make sure that that principle is deeply embedded into that culture, and what are we doing now about that, and et cetera. So those are some things that you might be able to do.
Great, thank you. So I've just got 3 feedback comments here, which I'm just going to share with you before we close down. So one was from John, who says, great and insightful. So that was obviously good. And Chiranjib says, wonderful, Robert. And Julie says, great webinar. We'll buy the book for more tips, as Bob knows so much he can't possibly share in an hour. I think that sums up the webinar.
Thank you. I hope that you enjoy it, and I hope that you share it with others. And Peter will be happy to discuss it with you. And if I can help you in any way, please feel free to contact me. Peter knows how to do that, and I think it's Robert@archesleadership.com.
Right, great. Thanks very much there. Right, so thank you very much. And Emma, I'll hand over to you to sort of wind us up for the day.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks very much, Robert. And yes, if you have any questions for Robert, you can either email him directly or myself, and I can pass the contact on to Robert as well. And you'll receive an email with some feedback, which is always great for us to have, including the webinar video recording. So yes, we hope to see you again in our future webinars, which you can find on our website. So yes, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Peter.
You're welcome.
Great.
Thank you, Emma, for helping.
Bye, everyone.
My pleasure.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Very nice to meet you. I look forward to meeting you someday face to face.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.